Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Anglican Renaissance podcast. In this podcast, I'm going to be talking about historic Anglican positions, going back to some of the influences at the Reformation, before the Reformation, since the Reformation, who have been particularly influential on the Anglican tradition broadly. Last episode, I had a conversation with Andrew from the Mariosity podcast, and that went really well. That was just on kind of the general view about development of doctrine in the Anglican worldview and how we might parse that issue out in comparison to, say, a Roman Catholic or in comparison to, say, a Restorationist Protestant. I do think the Anglican articulation is probably slightly different than maybe a Presbyterian articulation, but my guess is that if you are a classic Protestant, you'll listen to that whole episode and you won't really have any objections to the way we talk about those things. So if you're interested in the idea of development of doctrine and how that term can even be abused, we talk about that in the last episode. But this episode, I'm going to be talking about Peter Martyr Vermigli's doctrine of original sin. So if you don't know who Peter Martyr Vermigli is, or Peter, it would be Pietro Martire Vermigli, right? If he was born in I believe Lucca, Italy, or basically in the what's today Tuscany. He studied at the University of Padua. He was a monk, and he was eventually, an abbot, I believe, and he ran a bunch of monasteries and was an influential preacher in Padua. But slowly started to get more and more sympathetic with the Reformation. And he actually had a lot of allies who were more sympathetic to the Reformation. Some of them ended up joining the Reformation with him, which he ultimately does, and some of them ended up trying to kind of stay in the Roman magisterium and reform the magisterium from the inside. An example of this would be Reginald Pole, who is also related to England and the English Reformation and eventually Bloody Mary. And he's got an interesting life as well, and the two of them had an interesting history of being on the same side and then different sides, and then showing back up. Originally they're together in Italy, and then eventually they meet back up in England, and how their relationship changes and moves and develops is pretty interesting. That they eventually basically die as enemies, which is unfortunate. But that's not the story that I want to talk about today. Today, what I want to talk about is a section of Peter Martyr Vermigli's, what's called his Loci Communes, or I think it's called Commonplaces, what that translates to. He has this big work about his doctrines, and he has this section in Loci Communes called On Original Sin. Let me grab my book, my copy of the book here. Okay, this is the book. If you're interested, this book, just like the last book that I reviewed, is also being published by Davenant Press. So if you're interested in getting a copy for yourself, you should order a copy through Davenant Press. Davenant Press is a great resource for Anglicans who are looking for kind of historic Anglican resources that we can use to kind of retrieve our historic tradition. So in this episode, I'm going to be talking about Peter Martyr Vermigli's doctrine of original sin. So something important, I think, to start out with, and I'm surprised that Vermigli doesn't do this himself, but I think it would be worthwhile to start here. He actually gets pretty far into it before he even really describes what sin is. Because if we're going to be talking about original sin, what is sin? Why does God punish sin? What's going on? How do we inherit it? Right? Those are all the questions he's answering at first, because the context for this book is there was a Roman Catholic prelate named Albert Pigius, who actually has a lot more influence than you might think, who basically denied the doctrine of original guilt, we might call it, or even original sin. He says a lot of stuff about lust not being a sin. He goes farther than most Roman Catholics would go today, and that the magisterium eventually rebukes him for going. But Peter Martyr Vermigli is just interlocuting with Albert Pigius over this issue of original sin, and so in doing so, Peter Martyr Vermigli gives his doctrine of original sin, or his reception of the biblical doctrine and what he's received. He cites Augustine a lot. He definitely wants to point out that Augustine is on his side, and that Augustine believes stuff like concupiscence being sin, which we'll get into as the video goes on. But what is sin is kind of the question I think that's worth starting out with. And so in his chapter 15 of this section, he defines sin. And in this portion, he's kind of talking about Romans 5. And basically, he points out that what sin is humans were meant originally to be kind of, we were made in God's image. And in that sense, we have a rule. We have a place, a reigning ability over creation. We were supposed to, at least. And that's kind of the way we're like gods. He says everything else that we do is like animals. And so the responsibility that we have in creation, that role we have in creation, you might think of N.T. Wright, for instance, or Tim Mackey talking about our idea that we're a royal priesthood. We have this kind of stewardship over creation that we have a responsibility to live into. And he basically says that sin is when we fail to do what we were supposed to do. Every single time we fail, everything that is oriented against that object is sin. And I think that's the distinction he's trying to make over and against Pygius. Because Pygius, I think, like a lot of people today, especially secular people, when you start talking about sin, what they think sin is they think there's this, it's like a legal, it's entirely like a kind of legal transaction, right? If I am being accused or punished in the modern legal system, there has to be intent, there has to be, the action has to have been prescribed against me, I have to have been aware of what was wrong about what I did, because I'm being judicially punished by humans, basically. And that's not really entirely what's going on. And the Bible uses judicial language. The Bible, he also points out, uses financial language, debts, things like that. But the idea is we're not actually being punished in that exact same way as you would be punished in a courtroom. The reason we get punished in that way in a courtroom is because, we're all humans. We're fallible. You need evidence. We're not always sure that people are actually guilty of what we're accusing them of. There has to have been some kind of serious consequence to society that would incentivize us to treat this issue with the severity that we're going to treat it with. We have to make sure that it doesn't happen again, those kinds of things. God is not exactly dealing with sin in the same way that we deal with crime, let's say. The question at the heart of this is, are you reconcilable with the glory of God? Have you lived into that God-given role for humanity? The answer is either yes, you have lived completely into that role that God gave you, or no, you failed. It's pretty binary. It's kind of the point that Vermigli wants to point out. You either have or haven't. And as we all know, Romans 3:23, right, all have fallen short. Fallen short, right? There's this image of the fully lived out life, right? And that's just Christ. Christ is the only one who has not fallen short of the glory of God, right? Of the glory of God. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, is Romans 3:23. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean, that God exactly is taking a tally for every bad thing you've done. Although he does talk about how you may be punished for actual sins versus original sin, but he makes that distinction later. Or actually, he makes that distinction earlier, but I'm going to make that distinction later. The real thing that's happening is at the day of judgment, you are either reconcilable with God, a holy God, your creator, and you are made perfectly ready for the new heavens, the new earth. You're either there or you're not, and we're all not. And so that's why we needed kind of imputation of Christ's righteousness, right? Not just in a legalistic way, but also in a performative way. We have to be able to have something attached to who we are, something that is who we are, who is that perfect life, that perfectly lived out obedience to the life God wanted us to live. Anything else is falling short of the glory of God. Anything else. So that's where he gets into his doctrine of sin, of original sin, and grace. Okay, so Vermigli basically, going back to the beginning. So that's what sin is, right? Sin is this falling short. Okay, and then back at the beginning, his original issue with some people's takes on original sin, specifically Pygius, is that they don't really seem to understand what happened in the fall. Okay. What he wants to point out is that in the Garden of Eden, he says, Adam and Eve were free. They were free to choose righteousness or to choose unrighteousness, and they chose unrighteousness. And what the only reason they even had that ability, Peter Martyr Vermigli wants to point out, the only reason they even had that ability was the grace of God. They were already created with a perfect nature, because the opponent Pygius wants to say, oh, but humans were made good, and humans were made in a pair. Things like lust can't be bad because the attraction between men and women, that was a part of the garden. And what Peter Martyr Vermigli wants to say is that in the garden, Adam and Eve were created good. We agree. But a part of being good is being filled with the grace of God, filled with the Holy Spirit. They're walking with God in the garden. It's not like they were alone. They just weren't yet separated from God. That's why when the grace is withdrawn after the original sin, after they make that choice to follow their own way, right? That's what's happening, right? When they say they take a bite of the apple, or of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is they themselves want to make themselves God. They want to take that role. They want to do it on their own terms. And so because they're doing it on their own terms, that grace, which God uses then and now to bring us into obedience, is withdrawn. And that's why they fall. So the original state of nature where we are good, yes, includes this good human design, but then that included grace, which is now withdrawn. And so this state, this lack of grace, is what original sin is. So you get that kind of Adamic grace that really restores us, that they were in a true free will. They could choose between righteousness and unrighteousness, right? That was significant. But Adam and Eve rejected this state of Adamic grace and were cast into the wilderness of the world. And so that would be what's called original wholeness in this conversation. Because what Pygius wants to say is that we have this original wholeness now that Adam and Eve have had, and what Peter Martyr Vermigli says is we do not have that. And I think that he wants to say that's why we need grace. It's not, and then, because then we'll get into the rest of these things. And so original sin is really just that lack of grace. And what he says, the exact quote that I want to quote Peter Martyr Vermigli on here is, when divine righteousness is absent, the foundational principle we need for ordering and performing our works correctly is corrupted. We need that relationship with God to actually be rightly ordered. And that's grace. That's what grace is definitionally. Okay. And then so what he wants to identify the grace of election is that without election, without God's grace, we are totally lost. That's because that's not how we were supposed to be created. So what God does when he elects us is he restores us to that state of grace. And the difference between the grace that Adam got and the grace we're getting is that Adam could still choose unrighteousness or righteousness and would be judged based on that choice. Okay. And what happens when we're brought into a state of grace with God is that, yes, we still locally have those choices again, all the time, every day of our lives. We struggle with sin, just like Adam did. But the security we're given, the assurance we're given, is that is now on a road to ultimately fulfill the role that Adam was supposed to have in the garden, and that by God's grace, which now is multiplied, will be brought into a further communion with God by the graces secured by Christ on the cross, which are an order of magnitude higher than even the grace that was given to Adam. And so it's the result of God's mercy alone that we could ever claim righteousness. There is no sense in which the things that are proper or inherent to us are what give us the grounds to claim righteousness. Because what he wants to say against Pygius wants to talk about, right? Oh, but if we weren't capable of doing anything else, then how could God judge us? That doesn't seem right. And Pygius quotes all these texts about that the guilt of the father won't be imputed to the son. And Peter Martyr Vermigli says, yes, that is what the scriptures say. The guilt, in that sense, of the father is not going to be visited against the son. But that's because The guilt it comes for the actual sins, the things that we end up committing in life, right? So that original sin is a lack of a state of grace, a lack of grace, an absence of grace, which by our own, without that grace, we are not originally whole. And so when God looks upon us, we're not reconcilable with the new heavens and the new earth and with God. And so we're excluded from the new heavens and the new earth because we're not reconcilable with it. And it's only by God's grace that we become reconcilable with it. Okay. And then on the kind of day of judgment, right, when God is pronouncing judgment for guilt based on sins, in that sense, those are what are called actual sins. And he points out this distinction is made by St. Augustine, right? So once you get to like this age of accountability even, right, which we could debate when that age is, it's called actual sins, not because the other ones are not real sins, but because they pertain to acts. There are things that you do, and that they're a consequence of your nature. And he says that they are a consequence of that fallen nature. So when you're excluded from heaven based on original sin, it's because of your irreconcilability. But when you're actively punished in a way, in hell, right? Say in eternal conscious torment, you might be how we would put it today. That is on the basis of your actual sins. And those are more like that courtroom criminal, like you should have known better, all that stuff. And those merit punishment. And even the elect, he points out, if you actually measured up their actual sins, most of the time, would be judged, or even the most holy person, if you judged them based off of their actual sins, would fall short of the glory of God, and so they would be punished. And so in that sense, the terms that he starts to use to differentiate these things are the actual sin and then concupiscence. And this is, I think, where there might be more difference between the Protestant traditions and the Roman Catholic traditions. From what I understand, even in the 39 Articles of Religion, there is a specific section which points out that we affirm that concupiscence is sin. And based off of Vermigli's understanding, this is basically Augustine's perspective. And this is not only Augustine's perspective, but it's Paul's perspective. When Paul talks in Romans 8, I believe, about covetousness and knowing covetousness was sin, right? When Jesus talks about looking at a woman in lust, it is like committing adultery in your heart. There's this element of our desires, the things that are proper to us, the things that are inherent to our will, are guilt-worthy. They're blameworthy, and the actual sins are kind of the signs of that. And so while Vermigli is willing to grant that concupiscence is kind of a lesser sin than actual sin, if you will, to Pygius, it doesn't mean that it's not sin. And especially before baptism, he wants to say that concupiscence is guilt-worthy. It's something that God could judge us on, and it's something that deserves to be punished, because it's something proper to our nature, which is sinful, basically. And again, I think this makes more sense if you understand Vermigli's articulation that he makes about what even sin is, and it's this missing the mark idea, right? This falling short of the glory of God idea. And if concupiscence is a part of the glory of God, that just doesn't make sense, because why would in the new heavens and the new earth we desire bad things, right? Simple as. So God has to rightly exclude that from the new heavens and the new earth, is kind of his point there. And so someone might say, oh, it is going to be excluded, purgatory moment or something like that. I'm not sure how the Roman Catholic Church would reconcile that idea, but Vermigli's is pretty clear that this is what the Orthodox perspective on concupiscence is. And so at the end of the day, what he's trying to point out is that the doctrine of original sin is not entirely what Pygius thinks that it is, but the properly understood doctrine is true. And I think a lot of people struggle with this today. I don't take my word for it. You can look up in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there are a lot of people who struggle with the idea of original sin. They want to call it ancestral sin. They want to juxtapose that with a Western view, which they'll call original guilt. And they want to say, in this worldview, God is judging people for something that they can't control. And actually, I think that's the root of a lot of the objections to the kind of reformed understanding of soteriology. Is doesn't it seem like you guys are talking about God punishing people for things that they couldn't have chosen otherwise, right? Think about the idea of total depravity. The idea of total depravity is that humans on our own can't choose righteousness, and God has to give us grace. And people really are bothered by the idea of that, and I think fairly, when they don't properly understand it, they're bothered by the idea that God would expect something from us that we can't uh, comply with, and then punish us when we don't comply, and then not give us grace when that was the only way we could have not done it. And I think, again, it's because they have this understanding of a kind of courtroom. Imagine if somebody had gotten arrested for a crime that they did commit, they committed the crime, but they couldn't have not committed the crime, if that makes sense. And it's only a crime, and the judge, okay, knew they were going to commit the crime before they did, didn't stop them from committing the crime. They committed the crime, and then the judge held them accountable. And people, I think this is how they see the reformed view. And then God punishes them for that crime. And to one extent, you know, the refrain, I think, that knee-jerk reaction that Calvinists want to have with this kind of language is, oh, but what you don't understand is that God can do what he wants with his creation. They'll talk about Romans. And I think that's true. That's not a wrong rejection. But to the other person, this is basically to them saying God is not just. God just does whatever he wants, and he's kind of an arbitrary God, which is not the Reformed perspective. It's not the perspective Vermigli held to. It's not the perspective that Augustine held to. The point we want to make is God wants to reconcile all of creation to himself. And the things in creation that cannot be reconciled to God are going to be excluded from that reconciliation. Simple as. The doctrine of original sin that he defines, Peter Martyr Vermigli defines it as original sin, which he's arguing here that, you know, is punishable. And we'll talk about infant damnation in a second, right? But he's arguing that original sin is the corrupting of the whole human nature derived from the fall of the first parent and passed on to posterity through procreation, which, unless the gift of Christ gives aid, sentences all who are born in this state to almost infinite evils and eternal damnation. And so you might say, wait, where is that about God judging? And there's this idea here where he says at the end, all who are born in this state, the sentences, all who are born in this state to almost infinite evils and eternal damnation. What does that mean? It means that the posture of original sin, if played out on its own, would damn everyone. It would create hell. That is the thing that created hell, right? When you look at Genesis 1, it says God created the heavens and the earth, and then talks about how they're good. Okay? It doesn't say God created hell. Why does it not say that God created hell? Right? Is God not, you know, the master of the universe, all that other kind of stuff? No. But hell is a consequence of the rebellion against God's order, if that makes sense. It's a state of being. It's not a physical place, right? A lot of the metaphors used are for it being below or down, right? But any modern geologist or geographer can tell you that there's not, in like the Earth's mantle, right? There's no hell there. It's not a physical place. There's not like little red devils with pitchforks poking people. It's a state of being. And you can see even on Earth, you know, there's a point that I think is made in the Old Testament. There are these places where they're physically devoted to destruction based off of their choice to disobey God. And then God brings that about, that destruction. So in Sodom and Gomorrah, right, it's not described as a pleasant place to live, right? It's described as horrible. And they're rapists, and they're trying to attack angels and stuff when they get there. But this is a place where they don't want to, you know, they don't think they need God, basically, is the perception here. They're going to do it on their own terms. And as a result of that thought, they are experiencing evil and eternal damnation, because that's the consequence of that choice made infinite, if you will. And that's the root of all those problems. And there's an infinite different variety of ways you can rebel against God. You can rebel against God in that way, which contradicts another way to rebel against God, sure. But all of those other ways um, are lead to eternal destruction, damnation, conflict. They lead to discord in creation, right? Why? Well, like Peter Martyr Vermigli is pointing out with the garden, right? Is the garden was this place where everything worked together because it was going according to God's design, and even in the garden, it required that relationship with God, that part of humanity which was receptive to God's grace, right? And then that grace from God flowed through them, and they participated in the way they were supposed to in creation, and that was the creation order. And the reason hell ever comes into existence is because of the lack of cooperation. All right. That is another example of this. I want to, before we move on, is in the book of Joshua, when it's talking about Joshua entering the land of Canaan, the Israelites, and all of that conflict and all that war. Almost every time it talks about destroying, when Joshua is commanded to destroy, they're just, say Canaanites or something like that. These people are described as already being devoted to destruction. That's the term, devoted to destruction. So they're going their own way, and that leads to destruction. The things that are inherent to them are going to end up in destruction. And if you think that's weird, and you're saying, okay, well, I know lots of people in my life who are not Christians, they're not believers, and they're not, manifestly, it's not, Gulag Archipelago, all those kinds of things. It's not Auschwitz yet. So you say abandoning God, in some sense, actually manifests itself very quickly as, or it manifests itself eventually as hell. But I don't see that. And the classical understanding of this would be, especially in the Reformed world, would be the idea of common grace. So, in my opinion, actually, and I have lots of videos about this on my YouTube channel. They're not in the Anglican Renaissance podcast, but they're on my YouTube channel, Umbra, about the kind of argument from history. It looks like places that abandon God or actively reject God. Right? This might be a difference between societies like ancient China, where Christianity never shows up. They don't reject it either. It's kind of in this limbo. C.S. Lewis talks about this a little bit in Mere Christianity. They have their own civilization, and they're kind of combating the things, versus the societies which actively choose to reject God. That would talk about most of the World War II regimes, so fascists and communists, but also you can look even in the socialist Mexican regime in the early 20th century. It quickly, once there's this idea that this society, or the French Revolution is another example, once there's this active societal attempt to reject God, it quickly devolves into chaos, evil, mass murder, genocide. Like, I'm not exaggerating. And what we would say is that those societies are different than the ones, say, like America today, or even most Western societies for most of history, where there's this kind of cultural ambiguity, but the church exists, it is tolerated, and the church becomes a locus for common grace that everybody experiences. And being in a society with Christian heritage, we would argue, and I think the facts bear this out, is better than living in a society without Christian heritage, because the church kind of emanates with grace. And that grace is not enough to ultimately save anyone, right? There's also this sense in which the Reformed tradition will want to say that people on earth experience common grace. They experience all kinds of grace. God delivers grace to people in, say, baptism. Peter Martyr Vermigli wants to maintain the idea that baptism does clean us of, especially even it cleans us of original sin, right? All of these things definitely are effectual signs of grace. They actually deliver that grace to people that are not the elect, that will ultimately be saved forever in eternity. But God is loving, and so he loves those people, even the not elect. God still loves them, and so gives them undeserved grace as well. Now, that grace is just not this very specific kind of grace which ultimately results in eternal salvation. That's the difference. And you can hear terms like prevenient grace, or using common grace is, I think, a better term for that. And there's a significant difference between those types of grace and between election and all those kinds of things. And so today you might say, yeah, right, I know people who aren't elect who seem pretty swell people, but in a modern Western world, that's not the same as like Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Where the entire society is devoted to opposing God. Now, you can argue that we're getting closer to that society or not, and what the consequences of that have been, but that's basically the dichotomy that that we would want to point out, is that it's not really, right? It's not as artificial of a judgment as, say, our legal system is. Why? Because we had to invent our legal system to accommodate what we perceived as a lack of natural punishment. Dostoevsky actually meditates on this idea in Crime and Punishment, if you're interested, but as Christians, we actually believe that the world punishes naturally evil because God is good and he is Lord over everything. But that in our modern, bureaucratic societies, it would feel wrong if we just let people murder everybody, right? If they wanted to. So we wanted to put into place these legal systems and punishment to dissuade people from doing that. And God signs off on that kind of a government. Don't get me wrong. I think that's kind of Romans 14. That's also what one of the functions of the law was, is this kind of practical eye for an eye. Like, that is justice in an earthly sense. And we project that understanding, that human rule, onto God's rule. But God's rule isn't that. God is infinite, right? Think about it like this. If God wants to reconcile the finite to himself, but the finite approaches God and the finite without being, you might say, clothed in righteousness, if the finite approached the infinite and encountered that infinity, the things that were proper to that finite thing approaching the infinite would magnify themselves, glorify themselves in some sense, expand on themselves, and go to their natural conclusions. That's what we think kind of happens in the eschaton, right? In some sense. So if something is devoted to destruction, its internal orientation is away from God. When they approach God, it's blown away. It's not reconciled, right? Even the idea of fire is kind of a earthly metaphor for this process that's not really earthly. It's a heavenly reality. It's a extra temporal, extra earthly reality, right? And that separation happens and that filtering happens. This is what happens. This is why in the Old Testament, when people approach the Holy of Holies of the temple unworthily, they're blown away. They die instantly, because the Holy of Holies is the place of God's significant, unmediated presence in a way. And so if there's not that righteousness, it amplifies unrighteousness, and that unrighteousness is just destruction. That's why sin is death, right? Death is a separation from life. And so this system is really, natural. It's a process. It comes about on its own accord. And I think Peter Martyr Vermigli wants to point that out. So when we try to use our language about judgment to talk about this, sometimes it can be helpful, but sometimes it can't. I wouldn't want to say that it's never helpful. I think, God inspires that language to be used in Scripture to talk about these issues. I could think about God calling us children of wrath, right? Wrath is this idea that this is God's disposition towards evil, is just destruction. But then there's also God's mercy, and that's why we have election. And even in those two categories, there's this element where God is still, because of his justice, required to be wrathful, in some sense, even to the elect. And that's where the atonement comes in, right? The atonement, basically, the idea is that Christ was our sin offering for the sin of the elect, and for the sins of the whole world, even. And even the common grace that we talked about earlier was secured at the cross. That's why even Reformed theologians like John Davenant would want to take issue with, say, the limited atonement articulation of some Reformed folks or some Calvinist folks. But we get explicit statements that God died for the whole world. But it's this idea that God died to renew creation as well. And so, but then even for, right, so God has to have, not trying to get sidetracked about the atonement, right? But the atonement was about how God is still just, his justice and his wrath are still, or his wrath towards evil are still secured in so far as his posture towards the elect because of the atonement. And then in relation to the non-elect, or we might call the reprobate, God's posture is both just because he's punishing evil, but also still merciful because of that common grace. And still there's that element of mercy that God ultimately has for the elect. And we can talk about Christ and Scotism some other time, but I think that's far outside the scope of this podcast. Okay, so before we wrap up this podcast, let's talk about some of the controversial issues around original sin and how Peter Martyr Vermigli deals with them. The idea is, are babies then who are not baptized, do they go to hell? A lot of people today kind of, don't really chafe at this idea. It seems pretty horrific, and there are people who engage with it in different ways. And there are lots of lines where it seems like we're born in sin, born in iniquity in Scripture, and you can find those lists of those quotes, right? Ephesians, like I just referenced earlier, I think it's Ephesians 2:3, calls us children of wrath, right? People are born in this state, all of sin and fallen short of the glory of God. That doesn't say except babies, right? St. Augustine wants to be pretty clear that he thinks all babies are born in a state of guilt-worthy sin, and God can condemn them. If we're talking here about how baptism cleanses us of original sin, but original sin is grounds enough to exclude us from the glory of God in heaven, does that mean that God damns babies when they die unbaptized? And what Peter Martyr Vermigli wants to say is, A, we can't really claim to know the specifics. That's kind of hard to know for sure. But his inclination would be that some of the children of the righteous, so those who are elect, their children, even if they die before baptism, say there's unfortunately a miscarriage or some other tragedy, that they're children of the elect. We get a line in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 7, I want to say, 7 something, about how the righteous wife makes her husband holy, and the righteous husband makes her wife holy because their children are holy. The assumption that's made in that line is that the children of someone who is righteous are holy. Well, it does talk about the potentially, if the spouse leaves their wife or leaves the house where they share together, the spouse might not be saved. It says that explicitly, I believe, in 1 Corinthians 7, but doesn't say that that's not true for the children. So the implication is, I think, that the children of the elect are elect, and basically what Peter Martyr Vermigli says is that if you do have a strong doctrine of election, you can rightly say, okay, well, I don't know the will of God. It's possible one of those babies was elect, and so they were predestined to everlasting life. That's all that it takes. We have that strong enough doctrine of a grace to say that not all babies are damned. Basically, it would be his justification. However, what he says is that because we don't really know that, and there's no assurance. The idea is, if say hypothetically, right, you have a baby, that baby is baptized as a baby, and then does not unfortunately live much longer than that, you can actually be assured that that baby died in a state of grace, because we have baptism, and he has a very strong view of baptism that we inherit as Anglicans. I would say people who might be wondering why I'm talking about Peter Martyr Vermigli in this episode of Anglican Renaissance. Well, Peter Martyr Vermigli had a very strong influence on Cranmer and people like this. And I think people from the Anglican tradition are very wary about continental reformers because they tend to have very low views of baptism and very low views of the Lord's Supper. But that's not true about Vermigli, at least. Vermigli has a very high view of baptism. He wants to say baptism, every time it's administered rightly, cleanses of original sin. So we can say in the case of babies who are baptized and then die in that state of grace before accruing actual sin, you can be pretty much assured, you can be pretty confident that that baby was probably elect and died in a state of grace. He talks about how well, I won't even get into that, but basically he says that that's the view. However, what he thinks is more preposterous is the idea that all babies who die ever are instant, because then you can talk about, I think David talks about his son that he lost in seeing him in heaven, or a baby that he lost seeing him in heaven. So people will say that's proof of a lack of infant damnation. And what he wants to say is, well, we don't have that for the children of the unrighteous. Wouldn't it be more preposterous if all of the babies of every society that weren't Christian would be going to heaven so long as they died as infants? Wouldn't we then want to kill all of the babies? And I mean, God forbid, of course, but wouldn't it then be okay to have abortion and be rampant in every society that wasn't Christian, so to guarantee that all these babies go to heaven? It's not worth entertaining that idea, basically. And so playing with all of those ideas, he basically says that it's hard to tell, and there are some really good Christian predecessors in the faith, some learned fathers like Augustine, who would say that babies that are unbaptized go to hell. What the last caveat that he wants to make, though, is that dying by original sin has its own guilt, and he says we're assured, though, that our punishments are proportionate to our sin. And so whatever the guilt of original sin is, it's there, it's a thing. And so if you're punished solely on the grounds of original sin, but you have not yet accrued actual sins, it's probably a lesser punishment. It's more like, and again, his idea of punishment of hell is more about exclusion from heaven. So in some sense, if a baby is unbaptized and if they are being excluded from heaven, they have not accrued actual sins, and so they're not, like, it's not like getting every fingernail ripped off or something horribly gruesome like that. It might be just kind of a mere exclusion. And this is him saying he doesn't know, of course, what the details are, but kind of posturing about what it could possibly be. And postulating, I think, actually is what the word I should have used is. And so he basically wants to point out that even if we're saying, in some sense, the entailment of this theology or the biblical worldview is that some babies are excluded from heaven, it's not the same kind of, it maybe not the same kind of eternal conscious torment you're envisioning for Hitler, let's say. It's something different. All right. I think that fully canvasses, hopefully, Peter Martyr Vermigli's ideas around original sin. And you might have gotten through this whole episode and you say, hey, here's where I disagree, here's where I don't think that's true, and here's your biblical citations. And I didn't really cite a lot of scripture in this because he cites a lot of scripture and I'm just quoting him. So if you really want to engage with his worldview, you should totally pick up this book on original sin, which is from volume 1 of his Loci Communis. The edition that I'm using is translated by Kirk Summers, and this is put out by Davenant Press, and you should definitely check them out if you haven't already. There's a cool intro forward in this book by Chris Castaldo, if you know who that is, where he talks a lot about Vermigli's life before, or just his life, his biography, so that you can get a lot of context for his thoughts here. I mean, it's hard not to think, okay, his kind of training, his scholastic training, in a lot of ways. Because he in this book, for instance, he cites Aquinas, he cites Scotus, and he does the same thing in others. He cites Bonaventure. He's a lot more scholastic training than even Calvin. And, I haven't read enough by Vermigli or Calvin to really pronounce a final judgment about who was superior. But I do think it leads to Vermigli using a lot more precise language. It leads to him kind of being in conversation with the church that came before him rather than in discontinuity with the church that came before him. I think it's what really explains his higher view of the sacraments, and in general, his how he was reconcilable in a way with the Anglican Reformation, which was a lot more conservative and more tied to the traditions of the pre-Reformation church. So yeah, if you want to engage with him and you disagree, you should pick up the book. I imagine there will be comments anyway of people disagreeing with me, but really disagreeing with him in the comments. And if you pick up a copy of him to engage. If you really liked this video, be sure to like it. If you're listening to this podcast on Spotify, be sure to leave a review. I've been pleasantly surprised to see that there are people in fairly significant numbers listening to this on Spotify. So hopefully this has been helpful. The audio problems of the past 2 episodes should be fixed in this episode, hopefully. Thank you so much for watching or listening, and God bless.